computer. All right. How are we looking, Joanne?
Looks great.
Perfect.
Hey, well, I appreciate everybody's time tonight. I just offered to do this presentation because I found the last speaker's presentation very interesting, but I think that someone asked the question of, well, can you see the effects of my prescribed burn? And the answer kind of wasn't misleading, but it didn't provide the entire context, because when you're looking from above or remote sensing or large areas, very difficult to see the surface. But there is a lot of ways we can look at it and measure it, and we have, and we even know what it means during a wildfire and the biodiversity. So that's what I want to talk about today. And notice the lifeboat over on the right and the little web of life around it. I'm going to tie that in at the very end here. So next slide, please. And I'm going to try to leave plenty of time for questions at the end. So what I'm going to talk about tonight are evidence of fuel changes from prescribed fire, or it can come from managed fire, and talking about the scale of that treatment, what fuel layer you're talking about, surface or ground, whether you're just observing it, which I do all the time, or measuring it, some local examples. I'll do it, burns at my place, and then some work I've done for the Yuba Watershed Institute. And I'm just going to touch on a little bit about modeling at the site level, because the information you use and the models and the approach are a little different than at the larger landscape scale. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about, and partly in between along the way, evaluating what it means. What have you really done for fuel hazard reduction? What have you really done for ecosystem or forest or ecological restoration benefits? So next slide, please. In advance. There you go. So I think some of this stuff people probably know, and if you don't, I'm going to just kind of introduce it. And if you do, well, then you'll know more of what I'm talking about. And I apologize for the photos. They were higher resolution, but I had so many in here, it just blew the internet up. I had to reduce, compress. So anyway, when we're looking at what's changing with a prescribed fire, anytime we're talking about fuels and fire behavior, we break it down into layers, which I think you've all heard about. The surface, which you can see the ruler there, the dead material, the duff, the litter, the sticks, the logs. And then a lot of people don't really think about the live understory fuels as being important, although if you're doing burning, you can see it being consumed, but it's very important in much of our forest landscapes here. And then the ladder fuels. How close are the understory plants or those fuels to the tree crowns above? And sometimes plants like shrubs or even vines or small trees that are classified as surface live fuels also are categorized as ladder fuels because they just go from one to the other. And then the crown fuels, usually we're talking about trees, but in chaparral it can include the shrubs. We're talking about the heights of the top height of the whole crown or canopy, and then the base, where that live crown starts. Or in the case of Canada, they actually look at where the dead branches are starting to thicken up, because those provide ladders as well. And then there's this concept called canopy bulk density, which sounds a little complicated, but this is what we use to measure or estimate how many fuels are held in the forest canopy overall. We can look at an individual tree, but we can also look at the volume or the weight of foliage within a volume of air up in the canopy. So it's canopy bulk density. And it turns out how compact it is important. So if it's squished down vertically, like in a plantation, you have a higher bulk density than you might in a old growth stand, which can also have high bulk density, but may have the trees more layered and different, some taller, some shorter, and sometimes there's more air in between. So it's not necessarily just about the age or the size of the trees, it's how compact they are. So next slide, please. Go ahead to the next one. All right, so what are we looking at when we look at evidence of fuel changes from treatments? So this is really kind of tying in with what the speaker talked about last time, is a lot of how we detect those changes depends on what our perspective is and what that fuel layer is, how well we can detect it from the ground and above the canopy, the air, remote sensing, etc. So for surface fuels, the litter, the duff, sticks, the lower understory live fuels, you almost always have to detect that from the ground. Looking at it, measuring it, either with photos or there's ground-based LiDAR, although that, it only gets so many of the dead fuels. But crown fuels, the forest canopy or chaparral, you can see it from above or the ground, either one. So if you're doing, a large-scale area or a big neighborhood and all the parcels in there or around the town of Grass Valley or an entire national forest or the western U.S., you're looking from above. You're using a satellite set of data or from a drone, and it's really, really difficult to detect what's underneath. In fact, in a forest, it's almost impossible. And I've been involved with LiDAR researchers, and we've tried to see, well, LiDAR is a remote sensing tool that sends the signals down through the forest canopy, but it's only going to pick up so much of what's on the surface. So the bottom line is, if you want to know what's changing with the surface fuels and the ground fuels, pretty much the only real reliable way to do it is from the ground. So that's why I believe that the last presenter, Carrie, when someone asked her, can you detect the difference I'm making in prescribed burn, she says, no, it's not really making a difference. And I don't think she meant that your burning's not making a difference to fuels. It's just that you can't see it from above. So, the scale or the size of the area, the smaller the area when you're down on the ground, you can detect all the fuel layers. But at the landscape or multiple sites, like I just said, there you're pretty much measuring the crowns and then you're inferring or you're estimating or you're modeling the surface fuel. So here tonight, we're emphasizing the individual or site scale because that's what we do. Okay, next slide, please. So how do we do that? How do we look at changes? How do we measure those changes? Well, one of the best ways to do it, and it actually happens on prescribed fires that professionals do, is they may not have a lot of time to go out there and lay a tape down and count the sticks and take a ruler out and measure, which I've done many times, hundreds of times, including in front of wildfires. But they'll take photos. They'll take a photo before and after of the same area. And one of the things you can also do when you're doing that is you may be looking at, how much live understory fuel, like in this photo on the lower left, you can see maybe about 40% of the area is covered with shrubs and 60% with litter and and down, you know, branches and debris. So you might look at the mosaic of fuels and the types of fuels, and then afterwards you can say visually, well, now there's hardly any shrubs, or there's 30% of the area that's not burned, whatever you're interested in. Now, there's monitoring that also is kind of fun to do, that's simple. I didn't take a picture of it, but if you take a spike, like a big nail, and you can get it at the hardware store, you can put it in the soil, so just the head sticking at the top of the litter, don't smash it down. And then you can track for yourself, well, here's before I burned, here's how tall the litter and the duff was. And then go afterwards and see, oh, I see I've decreased that height by 1 inch or 2 inches. So that's kind of a fun thing to do. But we also do very detailed measurements where we actually literally count the number of sticks that are intersecting a transect, and we look at belt transects and estimate the cover and measure the heights and density of all the live components, grasses versus shrubs, etc. So there are in-depth ways to do it. And then there's this really great tool that the National Park Service developed, which are fire severity index ratings. And those you might be interested in. I'll show you an example later on. They just developed a system from 1 through 5 that, based upon how much of the foliage is charred or consumed, or how much of the litter, the duff, is consumed, or is there a lot of ash, or is the soil actually changed in color, you can just give yourself your own rating for an area about how severe your fire was. Next slide, please. Or how much fuels you consume. And then I have the little scale that's because we actually measure fuel moisture by collecting samples, weighing it before, drying it in an oven, and then weighing it after. So here's some local examples. I've burned all the time, as much as possible. And the more you do it, the easier it is, because then you have more. I have a lot of trails around anyway, bike trails my husband and son have built, but then I've got some, little fire lines scratched now, and the more small areas I burn, then it's safer to burn something next to it, because, if embers go, they're just going to go into there. But an example here is, this is in a bear clover, or kit-kit-dizzy, people like to call it, ponderosa pine forest, and I've got black oak, ponderosa pine. And that bear clover, it can be very old and decadent, with heights up to 24 inches or more. And after the fire, even 1 to 2 years, or it often sprouts the same year you burn it, no matter what time of year, because it's very hardy. The height will go down to 4 inches. Now that's very important, because the dominant fuel in this forest type, this vegetation type, is the bear clover. That is the dominant carrier of fire. And just a rule of thumb, under higher fire weather, you can assume that the flames will typically be at least 2 times the height of that plant. So if it's 1 to 2 feet tall bear clover before, during a fire, it's going to be, could be 3 times that. It could be 3 to 6 feet or more. And I'll show you a video capture later of a real fire on the Forest Hill district of the Tahoe, where it was crazy fire behavior in bear clover. So most of the time when it's burning, you can see immediate post-burn. Kind of hard to tell from my compressed photos, but the top photo, pretty much we've consumed all the foliage there, and a lot of the litter and the duff below, but there's still some litter there. The area below it, less consumption, and it was patchier. So there's still brown leaves on some of the bear clover, but it still consumed a lot of that resinous foliage, and so the fuel loading was greatly reduced. Now, what's also important is that the proportion of live versus dead fuel. So let's take a shrub, and if it's manzanita or if it's bear clover and it's young, it might be, 95% live. That does not burn as hot as if it's old and decadent and it's got at least 25% dead branches or worse on needle drape. Then it burns a lot hotter. It's more available to burn. So when I do my prescribed burns, one of the immediate things that I get is that the proportion of live fuel in the shrubs really shifts towards the live, unless I haven't burned it very hot, and then sometimes I still have a lot of that dead bear clover litter there. So I'm also looking to see if I've decreased the litter and dust depth, and most of the time I've at least cut it in half. Sometimes I'll just have, removed the very top fluffy surface layer. And people will ask me, well, you didn't do anything good there. Well, actually, I did. I've now consumed something that's flashier. It's easier to start with ember on fire. And it's, anytime you're reducing anything, it's going to burn with less intensity. So next slide, please. Next.
Sorry, there's a little bit of a lag, Joanne.
That's okay. I'll try not to be patient. Okay. So most of my property is mixed conifer with a lot of Douglas fir, moist north slope with a lot of honeysuckle in it on the, and then a lot of, the dead and down material, the sticks. But it can get that honeysuckle. I didn't put the heights in here, but it can get to be, well over 2 feet tall, especially when it's draped around logs. And when it's been there for a number of years, it's got a very high dead component. So it's one of my biggest concerns during fire season is all of that buildup of live honeysuckle. I like the plant. It's great. It's native. It does cover the soil, but there's just such an accumulation of it. So I get all kinds of varied effects, and it's, as some people have commented on the chats back and forth, or it's hard to get a good burn window on a north slope because it can often be too moist to want to carry fire at all. One of the best times to burn it, and this is an example in the lower set of photos, is in the winter. And this year we had some very dry periods where we had all those north winds. And so there was an area with 3 1-acre burns steep, some of it 50% or more in slope. So by the time, your acres only count as flat from the map, but the reality is that was probably a total of 7 acres. We measured it. So in that case, even if you're trying to burn at low intensity, it's going to be hot because it's steep, and there was a lot of that old honeysuckle, and it had been so dry, but it was able to carry. So in that case, there was very good litter consumption and a lot of mostly top kill of the honeysuckle. Many of the plants we have in this Sierra Nevada sprout back after fire, or they have seeds that are stimulated to germinate, or they may have some structure that's allowing them to come back from way deep down. Like bear clover, they have rhizomes that are often 2 feet down because I've dug them up for classes. Or starflower has these cute little, they almost look like tubers, and they can be 6 to 8 inches down below the surface. So even an iris, even they have these, iris tubers when they're not really tubers, but corms. even though you may think you're burning hot, if it's a fast-moving fire, some people think slow is, slow is always good. Well, on a slope, it's not always easy to make it go slow. Sometimes it has better effects on the plants if you burn it fast. Because if it's moving faster, it means the heat there is there for less time. And it turns out that the longer that heat is there, the deeper that heat's going to penetrate into the soil. And that's especially the case with moist soils. So in this case, less than 1 month after the burn, on the bottom right, there's areas that have more litter than others. A lot of them don't have much at all, but I've seen iris come back, and violets, and ferns, and I have all kinds of other little things, and some of the honeysuckles coming back. So, it's already coming back, even though it happened not that long ago. Now, on the top row, it was equally tall, not quite as steep. And it was closer, well, it's not quite as steep. And I tried to burn it when it was moister. And it did okay, it was a little slower. Didn't consume as much of the litter and duff. You can see my third row column for the right with the ruler. So there's a lot of areas that it just burned that top part of it. But it top killed all of the honeysuckle. And that's really what I was after there, because that's going to be one of the dominant carriers of fire. And then the photo on the right, it's a little shady, but the small incense cedar there, we cut most of those ladder fuels out, but it did kill the lower branches. So now we've raised that canopy base height. So we've reduced the ladder from the surface below, and we've reduced and we've increased the canopy height. So the point I'm trying to get at with both the bear clover and the honeysuckle examples, you can have a wide variety of intensities and effects, and speed of the fire, rate of spread, and duration, and it's all good. You're always going to be reducing some portion of that surface fuel, and oftentimes the ladder fuel as well, in many instances. So some you're going to consume more than others, but it's going to make a difference, and I'll show you some evidence of that in a minute. Next slide, please. So how do I know this? How do I know that we're making a difference? So there's been a lot of projects I've been involved with in measuring fuels and the plant community before and after both wildfires and prescribed fires. And on wildfires, very oftentimes we were targeting areas that had had a treatment, either a thinning or a prescribed fire, and we were trying to actually measure. We set up heat-triggered video cameras, you can see on the left there. We had rate of spread sensors, temperature sensors. We even had heat flux sensors. And we would try to detect, okay, what's really changing when a wildfire spreads through this untreated area, like the one with the center photos with the fire, going higher up in the camera view, versus down below where it's been a prescribed fire. Well, I can tell you both of these examples. The top row was on Forest Hill District during the Ralston fire, and there was plenty of crown fire there. And this is where the bear clover was at least 2 feet tall. And that patch of pine trees we can see going up in the crowns, the bear clover laddered right up into that clump of pine trees. And then you see that photo with just covering the screen with flames. That was in the bear clover with the fire coming right at the camera. And the flames were 6 to 8 feet tall from bear clover. So are you making a difference when you burn your bear clover and you don't consume the litter and duff, but you only knock back, or it actually invigorates the bear clover? You darn right you are, because it wouldn't be looking like this. Now, the photo below is from the antelope fire on the east side of the Plumas National Forest, and that had burned at very, very high intensity. It was not nearly the size of the Dixie fire, but, still a lot of crown fire. Well, this is an area that had a prescribed fire, and it's just not doing so much as it goes through here because it had reduced those surface fuels. So we know that it can change fire behavior from measurements during wildfires. One way we've identified that. And this is my specialized team. I'm actually in that photo. And we were one of a kind, and we actually went ahead of the wildfire and had, trained hard for it so we could get in and out ahead of a fire in 30 minutes or less. Specialized team. Set up our equipment, because you usually have to get closer to where things are active, or you're predicting it's going to get active in order to get some of the fire behavior you need to test. So next slide, please. So the other project I was involved in is we developed a monitoring protocol and collected data for, number of years, at least 5, and I think some of my old team went back later than that. We were monitoring treatment effectiveness and fire effects across national forests in California. So this is some example of data coming out from 30 of the different sites across varied national forests of long leadal pine types. So pretty much that's ponderosa pine and some Jeffrey pine. And let's start with the left. So on the left, we have the y-axis is tons per acre. And on the bottom, we have 1 hour, 10 hour, and 100-hour fuels. So basically, these are the 1 hours are the little tiny. The 10 hours are getting a little bit, I believe they're 1/4 inch. And then the 100-hour is, or maybe 1/4 to 1, and then 100-hour 1 to 3 inches diameter. And you can see the the pre-treatment levels are in blue, the blue bars. And the orange are the post-treatment levels. And in each one, for the 1 hour, there's a set of bars for the mechanical, pre and post, and prescribed fire. Same with the 10-hour. Same with the 100-hour. So thank you for putting up those diameters. It's actually not quite right what the person put, but they're close. They're on the right track. So in each case, you can see that typically the mechanical treatment will increase the surface fuels. And that makes sense because they're cutting the trees. And when you cut the trees, then you're usually leaving some of the slash, and you're leaving some of the tops, and you're not removing any of that. The prescribed fire, it's going down each time, and how much it's going down, it depends on how much is consumed. So it's a very strong contrast of how the changes occur. So prescribed fire is making a big difference is what we see. And I'll show you later, well, how big of a difference is it? Does it matter? Well, it does. So if you look over to the right, or top right, the litter and the duff, a lot of people don't realize a lot of the weight of the fuel comes from the litter and the duff. And, there is some reduction in duff and litter with mechanical treatment, just because you usually have equipment going around and it's disturbing things. So it may just be shifting it, or it may be compacting it. But there's no doubt with prescribed fire, you're seeing quite a measurable difference there. So why is that important? First of all, that's a lot of where embers land and they start to carry and burn, aside from logs. Second of all, that's where a lot of the smoke comes from. Smoke and fires comes a lot from complete combustion of all the surface fuels in the duff and litter. Just because they have so many tons per acre, that's corresponding to how much smoke they're going to release. Of course, tree crowns release a lot too. So if you're reducing duff and litter during a prescribed fire when the smoke is light and you're not totally consuming it all in one shot, for the most part, or it's a small area, you're really changing the potential smoke. And you're opening up the soil for plants that need that mineral soil to germinate or heat to germinate. And then the fuel depth, the bottom right. The fuel depth is really important because it turns out we're not always sure why. Fire behavior and modeling it's not an exact thing at this point. It's very difficult to characterize and model. But we do know that fuel depth is one of the most key ingredients when we're trying to model it. And so prescribed fire on the right there, it drastically reduces that fuel depth, and that's in centimeters. So next slide, please. So the bottom line is, yes, these treatments make a difference when we systematically measure them using scientific methods. Now, using that same set of sites, one of my employees, Nicole, did her PhD using some of our data at UC Berkeley, if you recognize Scott Stevens' name there. And so what she did is she modeled what flame length you would get from different sites of these long needle pine sites. She didn't look at them all, but a lot of them, before and after. And, what she found, let's look at the two on the very left. K and F is the Klamath National Forest, and E is east and west is west. So before, flame length she predicted under pretty high fire weather as being over 8 feet, and after, less than half a foot. That's extremely significant, that change, because in the firefighting world, we use what we call the hauling chart, and it's kind of guidelines. Well, if it's less than 4 feet, I've got the little image of the firefighter, then you can go direct at it with people. If it's between 4 and 8 feet, then you're kind of starting to need some equipment like a bulldozer. You have to have an engine with you to pre-treat it first. And if you're above 8 feet, that's when you really have to, they start to say, well, you got to think about aircraft or your bigger bulldozer farther away, et cetera. So it makes a big difference when prescribed fire is changing it that much. And I'll tell you, that has nothing to do with, it has everything to do with changes in the surface fuel, reductions of duff, litter, that 1, 10, 100 hours, and the live understory fuels. That's what's making the difference. So in almost every case, you're seeing a dramatic change in that pre-flame length compared to post. So it does make a difference. When we model it, we think it does, and when we measure it, we know it does. So next slide, please. So with the measurements that my team and I, and they continued on after I retired, have made during wildfires, the change or the difference that we see on fires can be very dramatic. So the top photo, the top row, I talked about the bear clover site where you had an estimated 10 to 66 tons per acre of the live understory fuels, mostly the bear clover. And then over on the right, that happened to have been an area that was treated with prescribed fire. And I don't have a screenshot of the video because sometimes it triggered the camera from the side or something anyway. But we can tell from other evidence that the flame lengths were only 1 to 2 feet. So there was no slope there. Things are a little different, a little more oak, a little less open, but it had a lot less understory fuels, both dead and alive, and it burned differently even during they're next to each other, these sites. So same wildfire, same set of weather conditions. And below is the example from the antelope fire on the Plumas. I didn't have the best pictures there, but the one on the left, the site had a lot more, it wasn't treated, had a lot more ladder fuels and surface fuels, and it was a crown fire, where the site on the right had a prescribed fire. Next slide, please. Very, very hard to get this data. So, it's not like we had tons and tons of equipment and it's easy to do. It's very dangerous to do, and you have to work carefully with the team and have things timed right. So what information we got shows it made a difference. There's probably more that you could collect. And one could argue, well, fires are so extreme these days, would it still make a difference? And I'll show you an example from a private landowner's prescribed burn from the Dixie Fire area that shows, yeah, I think it can still make a difference. So I talked about the National Park Service Severity Index rating. And this is looking more at, okay, not have you consumed the fuels, but have you changed conifer mortality or conifer scorching or torching or consumption? Have you changed how the soils are affected? And so the Park Service rating in that table up on the top, on the left is the severity code for tree ratings, and it goes from 0 unburned, 1 little or no crown effects, 2 low scorch, just brown needles, 3 heavy needle scorch, so it's dark brown, red needles, no freeze, 4 heavy needle scorch, so red and black needles, and that's actually where the needles freeze in a certain direction, and then 5 heavy needle consumption, meaning none are left. So that graph on the left, this is an example of some results we found on the Antelope Fire and the Moonlight Fire near there. And treated areas had a lot less of that yellow, orange, and red, which is the moderate, high, and very high, whereas the untreated areas, it was all, effects to the crown of scorching or consumption of the crown. So, there was certainly still 40% of the treated areas that had those effects. And that's because it was a large fire and it was a major fire. That's going to happen, but it made a difference. So that's what I think of with fires that are going to come by my house. Well, I'm a little tiny area, but it might make a difference. And then on the right, soil severity, this was really dramatic. In the untreated area, those little checkerboard parts are where the soil was altered. And, the chemistry of it's altered, and either it's all ash or actually the color of the soil, the minerals are altered. So they're, over 60% of the soils in the untreated areas were heavily impacted, whereas, and ash isn't necessarily bad. I shouldn't say that totally, but in this case, we're talking about a lot of ash that's showing some color changes. Whereas the treated areas, there was still about 30% of the sites that had some of those effects, but not nearly the same. So definitely it was making a difference with soil severity. Next slide, please. Now, one of the things that makes a difference, especially now more than ever, but you never know, is how big is the treatment area. So, you know, you might wonder, well, will my little postage stamp burn make a difference? It can, or it may not. So on the bottom left, that's on the Moonlight Fire, one of the prescribed burn stands stayed green and the other didn't, although it still has, you know, the foliage is still yellow on the trees. Now, they're probably not going to survive if they are. Occasionally, pines will come back from that. But it is telling us that, well, for sure, those needles are going to fall and cover and protect the soil later, and the soil was not as heated. So it was a little better outcome, but there's no guarantees if it's huge. Depends on the fire. And the picture on the top, there's that patch there that's green, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit here. That's the private landowner where they did prescribed burning. They also did some understory thinning. So it depends in part on the weather. What was it doing? Was it the same weather went up to their property? Probably, but you never know. So it can change that. And then on the right, that's a set of maps and progression over the decades from a Lillooet Valley in Yosemite National Park, where it's in the backcountry and wilderness. And they started to allow fire to, you know, become restored to the landscape and burn naturally. And over time, it started to create this patchwork, because on the middle row, on the right, you can see that the green doesn't really overlap with the orange or the yellow. They're all, so what happens is the fire's going and it bumps into the area that was burned not that long ago and it stops. Or it burns through there and it doesn't go very far. So over time, you can see that the landscape, you know, it can make quite a difference. So if a wildfire came through here right now, it would make a huge difference. And we know that from wildfires that have come across Yosemite and parts of Sequoia Kings Canyon and the east side of the Sequoia National Forest, where I've been on many fires measuring this. You know, these types of fires, if they're managed under certain conditions, they can make a difference because they're large areas. It's getting harder to do that. The Tamarack fire was a good example. It's harder to just let fires do their thing unless they're way out in the middle of nowhere. So next slide, please. So a little bit about modeling fire behavior at the site or unit level. On this diagram on the left, it's not a simple thing to do. I mean, it kind of is. The models are pretty easy to just put stuff into, and some of the inputs are a little tricky. I'll show you in a minute. But what's dangerous is that you can do it, and you might have no idea whether the results are valid, because you have to do calibration. I'll talk about that. So the first in the yellow, you choose a fuel model. The second one down below, you choose a fuel, moisture, and weather input. And lastly, you run the model and then you calibrate it. So calibrating it means, does it pass the laugh test? Does it look reasonable? Or did you end up with 40-foot flame lengths when you just know that couldn't occur? Or did it end up with 3-foot flame lengths when you know it was in fire season? It should have been way more than that. So step number one, the fuel models, they call them fuel models because they're not fuel set of numbers. They use input data that's based in part on data from burn chambers or laboratories, like of extinction. It's not just how many 1-hour fuels on the acre. And then
Hey, Joanne, I'm sorry. I'm going to interrupt you just for a second. So I apologize. I cannot mute people from my end. So I need everybody to be vigilant on their own ends and mute themselves. There's one person that it sounds like you're in a car. If you could try to mute yourself, that would be great. Sorry about that, Joanne. Go ahead.
That's okay. And we can still hear you wherever it is. And number two, moisture and weather inputs, you choose. Are you trying to choose the worst case like in a wildfire season? Or you may be choosing prescribed fire conditions. So it's going to be cooler, you're going to say it's moister. And then when you run the model, number three, you can't just plug in numbers and assume it's correct. Like I said, you have to see if it's reasonable because they're not exact models. Modeling fire behavior is very, very complex. And right now they're working at some of the top areas, and they have been for a while, top labs on physics and process-based models. But those are very difficult to scale up to wildfire size. So they'll look at all these physics and dynamics of flames in a burn chamber, but then you get to a wildfire, well, you know, it doesn't just necessarily multiply or power of 2. That's not that easy. So the models we have are based on a combination of observations and experiments. They're empirical largely. And you know, what do you have to calibrate? So does it make sense? And you're going to do that based upon your experience, data, like I've shown you some data from training that you may have taken. And then there's adjustment factors usually, and those are based on, are the fuels taller or deeper than the representative model, or is there a higher load? So you can't just like play around with them. You have to have some rationale. So what I do is I have a lot of experience on wildfires and prescribed fires. I have the data that we've collected that I can go back and say, okay, well, this area that I have in bear clover is very similar to what we measured over on the Ralston fire near Forest Hill. So I'm going to see how my results, match with that for given weather conditions. So you calibrate it. And the two most commonly used models at the site level are Behave Plus and Nexus. Nexus is the one that I like to use, but they're both, have a very similar basis. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to go a little faster because I want to get to the last part first. It's very important. So the fuel models that you pick, there's a lengthy document, and you see photos, but you have to look at the description and kind of know how they're going to burn. Next slide. And then you can put it in, and in this case, this is an example from the Yuba Watershed Institute, where I'm showing a graph of flame length on the left and on the bottom, open wind speed. So this is showing me for different treatments, like the red line is ponderosa pine bear clover thinning only, and the green line is thinning and burning, what I can expect for flame lengths at different wind speeds. And I'm not going to go into this in great detail because I want to get to my what does it mean slide at the end. Go ahead. Next slide, please. This is just actual data we collected on plots in the Innomam forest, so we counted everything. Next slide, please. And here's a picture of the model inputs, and this is a whole nother presentation, so I'm not going to go into it, but not just a set of numbers that you measure to put in. Next slide, please. But you have to put in something for all of them. Now, this is what I really want to end with. Does my burn unit make a difference? Yes. And it depends on the context. What are the fire conditions, the size of the area treated, the surrounding area, time of day, where did it come from? Up a drainage, up a slope? Was it safe for firefighters? Were there any that were even able to be there? Well, these two photos on the top are from somebody's private property in Plumas County. I think they're kind of near Greenville. And you can see there's a green island there, and there's an island where there's still brown foliage on the needles. Well, this individual, there's a video on PBS, or a little short documentary, and they talked to this guy. It made a difference. Now, would it always have made a difference there? I don't know, but it looks like pretty dramatic change to me. And I know that fire accelerates in drainages and accelerates uphill. So I think it made a big difference there. Now, what about, I know there's chat going on the site, and people have talked about, well, I don't know if I should burn in the spring, and what if we don't know enough about the effects to this or that. And I am actually tying myself, jumping on board into that biodiversity lifeboat theory. And what that is a real theory that came from Mount St. Helens explosion. There's a lot in ecological literature written about this, a lot of research, is that little patches that remain may actually be covered in ash sometimes in Mount St. Helens, but they are little islands where living things remained. It could have been a seed, it could have been an animal underground, it could have been fungus spores underground, or it could have been a little refuge area where the wood rat or the mouse or the lizard were able to survive under the ground from the heat, and native bees, nest underground. And the birds may have been able to stay there because they usually can't fly away fast enough always when it's like this. We know that from banding them. So lifeboats are incredibly important to retaining biodiversity in areas. So even if you're just retaining a small postage stamp area, you may have done something really important for the larger landscape, especially if it's a big, high-severity fire, because there's just not a lot of that native diversity that's still remaining in the mature forest anywhere else. And I've got a little picture to the left of the oars of a pine seed flying down. There's a lot of concern right now that the fires are so big, there's so many trees consumed, that now the landscape is so far from where seeds could go, that they can't even reforest. And sure, we can plant trees, we can't plant them everywhere, and it's not going to be quite the same. So this is why I burn anytime I can. I'm not worried about whether it's spring or it's winter or it's fall. I burn where there's green plants coming up, and I actually do little experiments. Is it going to come back or not? And next slide, please. Most of the time I find that overall, I started out as a botanist, that the benefits to the plants are very good. I'll often see plants coming back immediately. The very fuzzy picture of violets, areas that I've burned repeatedly right next to my house and raked. There's just patches of violets I never had before. And the ones on the right, those are star flowers. I didn't even know those were there. I mean, I kind of seen one or two on my moist slope, but now there's fields of them. So sometimes it's just opening up that growing space or opening up some mineral soil, and releasing those nutrients with that ash that comes, whether it's full consumption or not. Indian pinks I have where I burned bear clover a number of times just keep showing up more and more. So, we have so many acres and acres of forest where native plants are just suppressed from all that litter and dust, that a lot of times they may be there or they may be hanging out below the surface. Lilies will do this. And then, you see a burn and all of a sudden things just open up. So if I can create one lifeboat by burning any season I can in a tiny little area, I'm not too worried about the impact of my tiny little area on what's going on right now in the spring. What I'm really hoping is that my little lifeboat will make a huge difference if and when that fire comes. So last slide is the next one. I probably repeated myself and not left time for questions. Makes me happy to burn too. I feel like I'm restoring the forest. So, in summary, it does make a visible difference what you're doing in the surface fuels. And we do know that that's a very important way to reduce potential fire behavior and effects. And we do know it's important to restoring ecosystems and habitat. And we know we don't know everything, but we know overall it's a good thing, either from the big picture or the little picture. And the more we do, the greater the likelihood it will be meaningful across large areas. And, you know, you can't just jump into modeling. And you can influence what the fuel changes and effects will be. And I think you guys know that and you're learning it. I learn about it all the time, each time I burn, about how I can control the behavior and effects based on fuel conditions, how much preparation I do, and my firing patterns. So I've taken up lots of your time tonight, and I'm sorry I didn't leave much time for questions. I can stay on a little longer. I'm glad you have hope, Nina.
Joanne, thank you so much. That was a really encouraging presentation, and I think it's awesome that you have the local species, and I just want to echo kind of what Joanne said. Just take every opportunity you can to get in front of fire and to keep learning and to ask questions. We have a lot of folks in this group that all have something to offer, so I appreciate it. But with that, is there maybe one question you can take, Joanne, one or two?
Sure.
If somebody has a question, please feel free to log on. If not, also no worries. So I'll let everybody get on with their night. Joanne, thank you. That was a great presentation.
Thank you.
All right, good night,
everybody.
everyone.
Happy burning.
All right, I'm gonna